In 2014, a man named David Rosenberg made a phone call. He was dying of thyroid cancer. He had weeks left, and there was one thing he needed to know before the end. He dialed a number in New York. A woman answered. He said, "Hi, this is David Rosenberg. I hope you're sitting down." On the other end of the line was Margaret Earl Katz. She was 70 years old. She had been waiting for this call for 53 years. David was her son. She had named him Stephen Mark Earl the day he was born. She had held him twice. Then he was taken from her arms, and she never saw him again. For 5 decades, Margaret called the adoption agency. She wrote letters. She showed up in person. Each time a family member got sick, she reported it so the information could reach her son. Once, when she went to the agency's office, a worker told her to leave or the police would be called. She never stopped looking. David found her 3 weeks before he died. In that final phone call, he learned something that had haunted him his entire life. His mother had loved him. She had never wanted to give him up. She had been forced. And she was one of 4 million. The period between 1945 and 1973 is now called the baby scoop era. The name comes from what happened. Babies were scooped, taken, removed from their mothers and handed to strangers, their identities erased, their records sealed, their origins buried under amended birth certificates that listed adoptive parents as if they had given birth. In 1951, approximately 33,800 non-relative adoptions occurred in the United States. By 1970, that number had nearly tripled to 89,200. During the 1960s alone, an estimated 2 million babies were surrendered. The total across the era approaches 4 million. In 1970, 80% of infants born to unmarried mothers were placed for adoption. By 1983, that figure had dropped to 4%. By 1995, it was less than 1%. Something changed. But what ended was not the desire of mothers to keep their children. What ended was the system that took them. Here is how it worked. A teenage girl gets pregnant. It is 1961 or 1955 or 1968. She does not understand how it happened because no one has explained reproduction to her. Sex education does not exist. Birth control is illegal for unmarried women in most states until 1972. Abortion is a crime. Her parents are horrified, not because their daughter is in danger, because the neighbors might find out. Within days, sometimes hours, the girl is sent away. Her family tells the community she is visiting an aunt or caring for a sick relative or attending a special school. The lies are prepared in advance. The girl vanishes from her own life. She arrives at a maternity home. There were more than 200 of these institutions operating across 44 states by the 1960s. They were run by the Florence Crittenton Association, the Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, Jewish agencies like Louise Wise Services in New York. They had names designed to sound peaceful: Lakeview, Willows, the home of redeeming love. The conditions inside were not peaceful. Girls were assigned fake names. They were forbidden from using their real identities. Their incoming and outgoing mail was read and censored. Phone calls were monitored or prohibited entirely. Contact with boyfriends was cut off. Contact with family was restricted. They performed manual labor, cooking, cleaning, laundry. They were not paid. They were told repeatedly that they were unfit to be mothers. They were told their children would be better off with real families. They were told that keeping their babies would be selfish. They were told that surrendering their children was the loving option. They were not told about welfare programs. They were not told about aid to families with dependent children. They were not told they had legal rights. They were not given access to lawyers. When labour began, many were taken to hospitals and left alone. Some were given drugs. A medication called scopolamine was administered to induce amnesia. Others were given nothing at all, forced to deliver in silence while nurses called them names. One woman, Francine Gertler, was 15 years old when she gave birth at an Episcopal home in New York in 1971. Her adoption file includes this line: "The birth mother told this social worker that she knew she had to give up her son as there was no other way." Decades later, Gertler said, "There was no other way because I was not given a choice." Margaret Earle was 16 when she became pregnant. Her boyfriend, George Katz, was the captain of his high school baseball team. They were in love. They wanted to get married. New York law required parental consent for marriage if the man was under 21 and the woman under 18. Both sets of parents refused. Margaret's mother, a German Jewish immigrant who had survived the war, called her daughter a whore to her face. Margaret was sent to Lakeview, a maternity home on Staten Island operated by Louise Wise Services. She arrived in September 1961, more than 6 months pregnant, wearing a winter coat in the warm weather to hide her body. At Lakeview, the girls were given fake wedding bands to wear on the rare occasions they left the building. Even so, passers-by sometimes hissed at them on the street. When Margaret went into labour on December 27, 1961, she was taken to a hospital and left alone. No one was allowed to be with her. After she gave birth, the nurses would not let her hold her son. She named him Stephen Mark Earle. She saw him twice, briefly, through the intervention of her boyfriend George, who snuck into the facility with a camera and took the only photograph that would exist of their son for the next 53 years. Then the social workers came. They told Margaret she had to sign the surrender papers. She refused. They told her that if she did not sign, her son would be placed in foster care indefinitely. They told her she would be declared a ward of the state. They told her she had nothing to offer him. One social worker said, "This nice Jewish family will give him a wonderful life with every comfort." Margaret signed. Her son's original birth certificate was sealed. His identity was erased. He became David Rosenberg, adopted by Holocaust survivors who adored him but could tell him nothing about where he came from. Margaret and George married 2 years later, in 1963. They had 3 more children together. They stayed married until George died, and Margaret never stopped looking for Stephen. The psychological theory behind these practices is worth examining because it reveals something about how systems justify cruelty. In the 1940s and 1950s, a new idea emerged among social workers and psychologists. They began to argue that unwed pregnancy was not an accident. It was a symptom of mental illness. A prominent theorist named Leontine Young published a pamphlet in 1954 arguing that unmarried mothers got pregnant on purpose, driven by neurosis and psychological defect. "Everything points to the purposeful nature of the act," Young wrote. This theory spread through the profession. It was taught in social work schools. It was cited in medical journals. It became the basis for policy. If unwed mothers were mentally ill, They were, by definition, unfit to raise children. If they were unfit, their babies should be given to healthy, married couples. If the babies were given away, the mothers could be rehabilitated and returned to normal society, their shame erased along with their children. A Canadian doctor named Marion Hilliard made the logic explicit in 1956. She said, "When she renounces her child for its own good, the unwed mother has learned a lot. She has learned an important human value. She has learned to pay the price of her misdemeanor." The surrender was not just a solution, it was punishment, and there was a market waiting to receive the product of that punishment. After World War II, something shifted in the American family. Returning soldiers married in record numbers. Birth rates exploded. The nuclear family became a cultural ideal. A working husband, a stay-at-home wife, children, a house in the suburbs. But some of those couples could not have children. Infertility carried its own stigma. And by the late 1940s, demand for adoptable white infants began to outstrip supply. The adoption industry saw an opportunity. Social Work and Social Problems, published in 1964 by the National Association of Social Workers, included a remarkable passage. It noted that white babies born out of wedlock were no longer considered a social problem. They were considered by many to be a social boon. The passage continued, "Because there are many more married couples wanting to adopt newborn white babies than there are babies, it may almost be said that they, rather than out-of-wedlock babies, are a social problem." Then came this sentence. "Sometimes social workers in adoption agencies have facetiously suggested setting up social provisions for more baby breeding." They wrote it down. They published it. They called it facetious. A sociologist named Clark Vincent observed an emerging pattern in 1960. He predicted that if demand for adoptable infants continued to exceed supply, a black market in babies might appear, where price paid was contingent on infants' background. The market did not need to be black. It was operating in plain sight. Maternity homes received fees from adoptive parents. Adoption agencies charged processing costs. Social workers built careers on the transfer of children from one family to another. The mothers were told they were giving their babies a better life. What they were actually doing was supplying inventory. I need to address something that complicates this story, because ignoring it would be dishonest. Many adoptive parents were loving. Many adopted children grew up happy. Many birth mothers in later interviews have said they are glad their children found good homes. This does not contradict what I am telling you. It confirms it. The question is not whether adoption can be good. The question is whether consent can be manufactured. Whether a system that isolates a 17-year-old from her family, denies her legal counsel, lies to her about her options, drugs her during childbirth, and threatens her with state action unless she signs away her rights. Whether that system can produce anything that deserves to be called a choice. The children who were adopted did not choose to be separated from their origins. The mothers who surrendered did not choose freely. The only parties who made choices were the institutions that designed the process and the couples who benefited from it. And the institutions made sure no one could ever undo what had been done. Adoption records were sealed in every state except Kansas and Alaska. Once sealed, they were closed permanently. An adopted person could not access their original birth certificate. A mother could not learn what had happened to her child. The wall between them was designed to be permanent. The official justification was privacy. Birth mothers, it was claimed, had been promised confidentiality. Revealing their identities would violate that promise. But here is what the mothers say. They were never promised privacy. They were promised silence. They were told to forget. They were told to go home and act like nothing had happened. They were told to get married and have children of their own, as if the child they had just given birth to belonged to someone else. They were told that time would heal the wound. Time did not heal it. One researcher described the experience as like losing a kid in the woods. You know your child is out there somewhere, you just don't know where. One mother said, "You hear about people's lives being touched by adoption. It's no damn touch. You're smashed by adoption. It alters the mother's lives forever." They were not promised privacy. They were conscripted into silence. And when they tried to speak, the records were locked and the agencies would not answer their calls. On March 21st, 2013, something happened that has never happened in the United States. The Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, stood in the Great Hall of Parliament House in Canberra. In front of her were more than 800 people. Mothers who had lost children, adoptees who had been separated from their origins, families torn apart by the same system that operated in America. She apologized. "We acknowledge the profound effects of these policies and practices on fathers," Gillard said, "and we recognize the hurt these actions cause to brothers and sisters, grandparents, partners, and extended family members. We deplore the shameful practices that denied you, the mothers, your fundamental rights and responsibilities to love and care for your children." The Australian government estimated that 250,000 babies had been taken from their mothers between the 1950s and the late 1970s. That is roughly 1/16 of the American total. Australia apologised. State governments apologised. Churches apologised. The government committed $11.5 million to support services for affected families. Ireland has apologised. Scotland apologised in 2023. Canada has acknowledged similar practices and provided support. The United States has done nothing. No federal apology, no state apology, no national commission, no investigation, no acknowledgement that anything wrong occurred. One American mother, Lydia Manderson, who surrendered her child in the 1960s and later testified before the United Nations about coercive adoption practices, put it simply, "No one has ever apologized to us or acknowledged our loss. Nobody ever acknowledged that this was a very traumatic event in our lives, and for the rest of our lives, as old as we are, it still has an effect." The women who lived through the baby scoop era are dying. Margaret Earl Katz is in her 80s now. Her son David died in 2014, 3 weeks after finding her. They had 53 years of separation and 3 weeks together at the end. Karen Wilson Butterball, who founded the Baby Scoop Era Research Initiative and wrote a book documenting the coercion tactics used against mothers, surrendered her daughter in 1966. She was at the Florence Crittenton home in Washington, D.C. She says she had no control when her baby was taken. Anne Fessler, who wrote The Girls Who Went Away, interviewed more than 100 women who surrendered children. She is an adoptee herself. Her birth mother gave her up in the 1950s. These women have spent decades trying to find their children. Many succeeded, many did not. Some found their children only to learn they had already died. And every year, more of them pass away without ever receiving what Australia gave its mothers, an acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. I want to return to something Margaret Earl Katz said in an interview after her son's death. She was asked about the sealed records, about the laws that kept mothers and children apart for decades. She said, "You know, it happened to millions of people. The heartbreak that must be for mothers and fathers who never knew what happened to their children. It's just not right." That phrase stayed with me. It's just not right. Not a demand, not an accusation, just a statement of fact, so obvious it should not need to be spoken. 4 million babies were taken from their mothers in the United States between 1945 and 1973. They were taken by a system that lied to young women, isolated them from support, threatened them with legal consequences, drugged them during labour, and sealed their records so they could never find each other. The mothers were told to forget. The children were told their origins did not matter. The adoptive parents were told a story that erased the pain underlying their family's creation. And then, when the era ended, everyone moved on as if it had never happened. Australia apologised. Ireland apologised. Scotland apologised. America is still waiting for someone to say what Margaret Earl Katz already knows. It's just not right. The mothers who surrendered are in their 70s, their 80s, their 90s. They have spent lifetimes carrying grief they were forbidden to express. They searched for children who did not know they were being searched for. They left medical records, hoping the information would reach sons and daughters who might need it. They called agencies that would not return their calls. They are running out of time. And still, no one has apologised. Not the agencies that took the babies, not the hospitals that drugged the mothers, not the social workers who threatened teenage girls with prosecution, not the state governments that sealed the records, not the federal government that watched it all happen. 4 million American families were broken by design. The architects of that system are celebrated in the histories of social work. The buildings where it happened have been repurposed or demolished. The records are still sealed in most states. And the mothers are still waiting for someone to say out loud what they have known for 60 years. What happened to them was not a choice. It was not a loving option. It was not in the best interest of the child. It was theft. It was coercion. It was the systematic exploitation of vulnerable young women by institutions that profited from their pain. And America has never said sorry.